While I was working as a doctor in the typhus block, I also had to take the place of the senior block warden who was ill. Therefore, I was responsible to the camp authority for keeping the huts clean, if clean can be used to describe such a condition. The pretense at inspection to which the hut was frequently submitted was more for the purpose of torture than of hygiene. More food and few drugs would have helped, but the only concern of the inspectors was whether a piece of straw was left in the center corridor, or whether the dirty, ragged, and verminous blankets of the patients were tucked in neatly at their feet. As to the fate of the inmates, they were quiet and concerned. If I reported smartly, whipping my prison cap from my shorn head and clicking my heels, hut number VY952 patients, 2 nursing order lines, and 1 doctor, they were satisfied. And then they would leave. But until they arrived, often they were hours later than announced, and sometimes did not come at all. I was forced to keep straightening blankets, picking up bits of straw which fell from the monks, and shouting at the poor devils who tossed in their beds, and threatened to upset all my effort at tidiness and cleanliness. Apathy was particularly increased among the feverish patients, so that they did not react at all unless they were shouted at. Even this failed at times, and then it took tremendous self-control not to strike them. In attempting this psychological presentation and a psychopathological explanation of the typical characteristics of a concentration camp inmate, I may give the impression that a human being is completely and unavoidably influenced by his surroundings. But what about human liberty? Is there no spiritual freedom in regard to behavior and reaction to any given surroundings? Is that theory through which would have us believe that man is no more than a product of many conditional and environmental factors? Be they of a biological, psychological, or sociological nature, is man but an accidental product of these? Most importantly, do the prisoner's reactions to the singular word of concentration camp prove that man cannot escape the influences of his surroundings? Does man have no choice of action in the face of such circumstances? We can answer these questions from experience as well as on principle. The experiences of camp life show that man does have a choice of action. There were enough examples, often of a heroic nature, which proved that apathy could be overcome, irritability suppressed. Man can preserve a vestige of spiritual freedom, of independence of mind, even in such terrible conditions of psychic and physical stress. We who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in numbers, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And there were always choices to make. Every day, every hour offered the opportunity to make a decision which determined whether you would or would not submit to those powers which threatened to rob you of your very self, your inner freedom, which determines whether or not you would become the plaything of circumstance, renouncing freedom and dignity to become molded in the form of the typical inmate. Seen from this point of view, the mental reactions of the inmates of concentration camp must seem more to us the more expression of certain physical and sociological conditions. Even though conditions such as lack of sleep, insufficient food, and various mental stresses may suggest that the inmates were bound to react in certain ways, in the final analysis, it became clear that the sort of person the prisoner became was a result of an inner decision, and not the result of camp influences alone. Fundamentally, therefore, any man can, even under such circumstances, decide what shall become of him, mentally and spiritually. He may retain his human dignity even in a concentration camp. Dostoevsky once said "There is only one thing that I dread, not to be worthy of my sufferings." These words frequently came to my mind after I became acquainted with those martyrs whose behavior in camp, whose suffering and death bore witness to the fact that the last inner freedom cannot be lost. It can be said that they were worthy of their suffering. The way they bore their suffering was a genuine inner achievement. It is this spiritual freedom which cannot be taken away that makes life meaningful and purposeful. An active life serves the purpose of giving man the opportunity to realize values in creative work, while the passive life of enjoyment affords him the opportunity to obtain fulfillment in experiencing beauty, art, or nature. There is also purpose in that life which is almost barren of both creation and enjoyment, and which admits of but one possibility of high moral behavior, namely, in man's attitude to his existence, an existence restricted by external forces. A creative life and a life of enjoyment are banned to him. But not only creativeness and enjoyment are meaningful. If there is a meaning in life at all, then there must be a meaning in suffering. Suffering is an ineradicable part of life, even as fate and death. Without suffering and death, human life cannot be complete. The way in which a man accepts his fate and all the suffering it entails, the way in which he takes up his cross, gives him ample opportunity, even under the most difficult circumstances, to add a deeper meaning to his life. He may remain brave, dignified, and unselfish, or in the bitter fight for self-preservation, he may forget his human dignity and become no more than an animal. Here lies a chance for man either to make use of or to forego the opportunities of attaining the moral values that a difficult situation may suffering or not. Do not think that these considerations are unworldly and too far removed from real life. It is true that only a few people are capable of reaching such high moral standards. Of the prisoners, only a few kept their full inner liberty and obtained those values which their suffering afforded. But even one such example is sufficient proof that man's inner strength may raise him above his outward fate. Such men are not only in concentration camps. Every man is confronted with fate, with the chance of achieving something through his own suffering. Take the faith of the sick, especially those who are incurable. I once read a letter written by a young invalid in which he told a friend that he had just found out he would not live for long, that even an operation would be of no help. He wrote further that he remembered the film he had seen in which a man was portrayed, who waited for death in a courageous and dignified way. The boy had thought it a great accomplishment to meet death so well. Now he wrote fate was offering him a similar chance. Those of us who saw the film called Resurrection, taken from a book by Tolstoy years ago, may have had similar thoughts. Here were great destinies and great men. For us at that time, there was no great fate. There was no chance to achieve such greatness. Perhaps there came a day for some of us when we saw the same film again or a similar one. But by then, the other pictures may have simultaneously unrolled before one's inner eyes. Picture of people who attained much more in their lives than a sentimental film could show. Some details of a particular man's inner greatness may have come to one's mind, like the story of the young man whose death I witnessed in a concentration camp. This young woman knew that she would die in the next few days, but when I talked to her, she was cheerful in spite of this knowledge. She said, "I'm grateful that fate has hit me so hard. In my former life, I was spoiled and did not take spiritual accomplishments seriously." Pointing through the window of the hut, she said, "This tree here is the only friend I have in my loneliness. I often talk to this tree." I was startled and didn't quite know to take her words was so delirious. Did she have occasional hallucinations? Anxiously, I asked her if the tree replied, and she said yes. What did it say to her? She answered, "It said to me, I'm here, I'm life, eternal life." Former prisoners, when writing or relating their experiences, agree that the most depressing influences of all was that the prisoner could not know how long this term of imprisonment would be. He had been given no date for his release. A well-known research psychologist has pointed out that life in a concentration camp could be called a provisional existence, which we can add to this by defining it as a provisional existence of unknown limits. The Latin word finis has two meanings: end for the finish and a goal to reach. A man who could not see the end of his provisional existence was not able to aim at an ultimate goal in life. He seized the living for the future in contrast to a man in normal life. Therefore, the whole structure of his inner life changed. Signs of decay set in, which we know from other areas of life. The unemployed worker, for example, is a similar position. His existence has become provisional, and in a certain sense, he cannot live for the future or aim at a goal. One of the prisoners who on his arrival marched with a long column of new inmates for the station in the camp told me later that he had felt as though he were marching at his own funeral. His life had seemed to him absolutely without future. He regarded it as over and done, as if he had already died. This feeling of lifelessness was intensified by other causes. In time, it was the limitlessness of the term of imprisonment which was most acutely felt. Any attempt at fighting the camp's psychopathological influence on a prisoner by psychotherapeutic or psychohygienic methods that had to aim at giving him inner strength by pointing out to him a future goal to which he could look forward. Instinctively, some of the prisoners attempted to find one on their own. It is a peculiarity of a man that he can only live by looking to the future. And this is his salvation in the most difficult moments of his existence, although he sometimes has to force his mind to the task. I remember a personal experience. I lived a few kilometers with our long column of men from the camp to our work site. Very cold, bitter winds struck us. I kept thinking of the endless little problems of our miserable life. What would there be to eat tonight? If a piece of sausage came as an extra ration, should I exchange it for a piece of bread? Should I trade my last cigarette, which was left, for bonus? How could I get a piece of wire to replace the fragment which served as one of my shoelaces? These questions came to mind. What could I do to get on good terms with a capo who could help me to obtain work in camp instead of undertaking this horribly long daily march? I became disgusted with a state of affairs which compelled me daily and hourly to think of only such trivial things. I forced my thoughts to turn to another subject. Suddenly, I saw myself standing at the platform of a well-lit, warm, and pleasant lecture room. In front of me sat an attentive audience on comfortable, upholstered seats. I was giving a lecture on the psychology of the concentration camp. All that oppressed me at that moment became objective, seen and described from the remote viewpoint of science. By this method, I succeeded somehow in rising above the situation, above the sufferings of the moment, and I observed them as if they were already of the past. Both I and my troubles became the object of an interesting psychoscientific study undertaken by myself. What does Spinoza say in his Ethics? Affectus cui passio est desinit esse passio simultac, ius claram et distinctam formationem ideum. Emotion, which is suffering, ceases to be suffering as soon as we form a clear and precise picture of it. The prisoner who had lost faith in the future, his future was doomed. With his loss of belief in the future, he also lost his spiritual hold. He let himself decline and became subject to mental and physical decay. Usually this happened quite suddenly in the form of a crisis, the symptoms of which were familiar to the experienced camping mates. We all feared this moment, not for ourselves, which would have been pointless, but for our friends. Usually it began with the prisoner refusing one morning to get dressed and wash or to go out on the parade grounds. I was a dramatic demonstration of the close link between the loss of faith in the future and this dangerous giving up. F., my senior Bloch-Waren, a fairly well-known composer and librettist, confided in me one day, "I would like to tell you something, doctor. I have had a strange dream. A voice told me that I could wish for something, that I should only say what I wanted to know, and all my questions would be answered. What do you think?" I asked. "That I would like to know when the war would be over for me." "You know what I mean, doctor? For me, I wanted to know when our camp would be liberated and our sufferings come to an end." "And when do you have this dream?" I asked. "In February 1945, he answered. "It was in the beginning of March." "What did your dream voice answer?" Furtively, he whispered to me, "March 30. When Mr. F. told me about his dream, he was still full of the hope and convinced that the voice of his dream would be right. But as the promised day drew nearer, the war news which reached our camp made it appear very unlikely that we would be free on the promised date. On March 9th, F suddenly became ill and ran a high temperature. On March 13th, the day his prophecy had told him that the war and suffering would be over for him, he became delirious and lost consciousness. On March 31st, he was dead. To all outward appearances, he had died of typhus. Those who know how close the connection is between the state of mind of a man, his courage and hope or lack of them, and the state of immunity of his body will understand that the sudden loss of hope and courage can have a deadly effect. The observations of this one case and the conclusion drawn from them, in accordance with something that was drawn to my attention by the chief doctor of our concentration camp, that their freight in the week between Christmas 1944 and New Year's 1945 increased in camp beyond all previous experiences. In his opinion, the explanation of this increase did not lie in the harder working conditions or the deterioration of our food supplies or a change of weather or known epidemics. These tasks and therefore the meaning of life differ from man to man and from moment to moment. Thus, it is impossible to define the meaning of life in a general way. Questions about the meaning of life can never be answered by sweeping statements. Life does not mean something vague, but something very real and concrete. Just as life's tasks are also very real and concrete, they form man's destiny, which is different and unique for each individual. No man and no destiny can be compared with any other man or any other destiny. No situation repeats itself, and each situation calls for a different response. Sometimes the situation in which a man finds himself may require him to shape his own fate by action. At other times, it is more advantageous for him to make use of an opportunity for contemplation and to realize assets in this way. When a man finds that it is his destiny to suffer, he will have to accept suffering as his task, his single and unique task. He will have to acknowledge the fact that even in suffering, he is unique and alone in the universe. No one can relieve him of his suffering or suffer in his place. His unique opportunity lies in the way in which he bears his burden. For us as prisoners, these thoughts were not speculations far removed from reality. They were only the thoughts that could be of help to us. They kept us from despair. Even there seemed to be no chance of coming out of it alive. Long ago, we had passed the stage of asking what was the meaning of life, a naive query which understands life as the attaining of some aim through the active creation of something of value. Once the meaning of suffering had been revealed to us, we refused to minimize or alleviate the camp's tortures by ignoring them or harboring false illusions and entertaining artificial optimism. Suffering had become a task on which we did not want to turn our backs. We had realized its hidden opportunities for achievements, the opportunities which caused us to get through the suffering. The tender beginnings of the psychotherapy or psychohygiene were when they were possible at all in the camp, either individual or collective in nature. The individual psychotherapeutic attempts were often a kind of life-saving procedure. These efforts were usually concerned with the prevention of suicides. A very strict camp ruling forbade any effort to save a man who attempted suicide. It was forbidden, for example, to cut down a man who was trying to hang himself. Therefore, it was all important to prevent these attempts from occurring. This uniqueness and singleness, which distinguishes each individual and gives a meaning to his existence, has a bearing on creative work as much as it does on a human love. When the impossibility of replacing a person is realized, he allows the responsibility which a man has for his existence and it continues to appear in all its magnitude. A man who becomes conscious of the responsibility he bears toward the human being who affectionately waits for him or to an unfinished work will never be able to throw away his life. He knows the why for his existence, and he will be able to bear almost any. God knows I was not in the mood to give psychological explanations or to preach any sermons to offer my comrades a kind of medical care of their souls. I was cold and hungry, irritable and tired, but I had to make the effort and use this unique opportunity. Encouragement was now more necessary than ever. So I began by mentioning the most trivial of comforts first. I said that even in this Europe in the 6th winter of the Second War, our situation was not the most terrible we could think of. Then I spoke about the future. I said to the impartial, the future must seem hopeless. I agreed that each of us could guess for himself how small were his chances of survival. I told them that although there was still no typhus epidemic in that camp, I estimated my own chances at about 1 in 20. But I also told them that in spite of this, I had no intention of losing hope and giving up. For no man knew what the future would bring, much less the next hour. But I did not talk only of the future and the veil which was drawn over it. I also mentioned the past, all its joys and how its light shone even in the prison darkness. Again, I quoted a poet to avoid sounding like a preacher myself who had written, "Was du erlebst, kann keine Macht der Welt dir rauben." What you have experienced, no power on earth can take from you. Not only our experiences, but all we've done. Whatever great thoughts we may have had, and all we have suffered, all this is not lost. Though it in the past, we brought it into being. Having been is also a kind of being and perhaps the surest kind. Then I spoke of the many opportunities of giving life a meaning. I told my comrades that human life under any circumstances never ceases to have a meaning, and that this infinite meaning of life includes suffering and dying, privation and death. I asked the poor creatures who listened to me attentively in the darkness of the hut to face up to the seriousness of our position. When I come to the third stage of a prisoner's mental reactions, the psychology of the prisoner after his liberation. But prior to that, we shall consider a question which the psychologist asks frequently, especially when he has personal knowledge of these matters. What can you tell us about the psychological makeup of the camp guards? How is it possible that men of flesh and blood could treat others as so many prisoners as they have been treated? Having once heard these accounts and having come to believe that these things did not happen, one is bound to ask how psychologically they could happen. To answer this question, without going into great detail, a few things must be pointed out. First, among the guards, there were some sadists and sadists in the purest clinical sense. Second, these sadists were always selected when a really severe detachment of guards were needed. There was great joy at our worksite when we had permission to warm ourselves for a few minutes in front of a little stove which was fed with twigs and scraps of wood, but there were always some foremen who found a great pleasure in taking this comfort from us. Third, the feelings of the majority of the guards had been dulled by the number of years in which, in ever-increasing doses, they had witnessed the brutal methods of the camp. These morally and mentally hardened men at least refused to take active part in sadistic measures, but they did not prevent others from carrying them out. Fourth, it must be stated that even among the guards there were some who took pity on us. I shall only mention the commander of the camp from which I was liberated. It was found later, after liberation, only the camp doctor, a prisoner himself, had known of it previously, that this man had paid no small sum of money for his own pocket in order to purchase medicines for his prisoners from the nearest market town. But the senior camp warden and prisoner himself was harder than any of the SS guards. He beat the other prisoners at every slightest opportunity, while the camp commander, to my knowledge, never once lifted his hand against any of us. It is apparent that the mere knowledge that a man was either a camp guard or a prisoner tells us almost nothing. Human kindness can be found in all groups, even those which as a whole it will be easy to condemn. The boundaries between groups overlap, and we must not try to simplify matters by saying that these men were angels and those were devils. Certainly, it was a considerable achievement for guard or foreman to be kind to the prisoners in spite of all camp influences, and on the other hand, the basis of a prisoner who treated his own companions badly was exceptionally contemptible. Obviously, the prisoners found the lack of character in such men especially upsetting, while they were profoundly moved by the smallest kindness received from any of the guards. I remember how one day a foreman secretly gave me a piece of bread, which I knew he must have saved from his breakfast ration. It was far more than the small piece of bread, which moved me to tears at that time. It was a human something, which this man also gave to me, the word and look which accompanied the gift. From all this, we may learn that there are two races of men in this world, but only these two, the race of the decent man and the race of the indecent man. Both are found everywhere. They penetrate into all groups of society. No group consists entirely of decent or indecent people. In this sense, no group is of pure race, and therefore one occasionally found a decent fellow among the camp guards. Life in a concentration camp tore open the human soul and exposed its depth. It is surprising that in those depths we again found only human qualities, which in their very nature were a mixture of good and evil. And now to the last chapter in the psychology of a concentration camp. The psychology of the prisoner was being released. In describing the experiences of liberation, which naturally must be personal, we shall pick up the threads of that part of our narrative which told of the morning when a white flag was hoisted above the camp gates after days of high tension. With tired steps, we prisoners dragged ourselves to the camp gates. Timidly, we looked around and glanced at each other questioningly. Then we ventured a few steps outside of the camp, and this time no orders were shouted at us, nor was there any need to duck quickly to avoid a blow or kick. Oh no! This time the guards offered us cigarettes. We hardly recognized them at first. They had hurriedly changed into civilian clothes. We walked slowly along the road leading from camp. Soon our legs hurt and threatened to buckle, but we limped on. We wanted to see the camp's surroundings for the first time with the eyes of a free man. Freedom was repeated to ourselves, and yet we could not grasp it. We had said this word so often during all the years we dreamed about it, that it had lost its meaning. Its reality did not penetrate into our consciousness. We could not grasp the fact that freedom was ours. We came to meadows full of flowers. We saw and realized that they were there, but we had no feelings about them. The first spark of joy came when we saw a rooster with a tail of multicolored feathers, but it remained only a spark. We did not yet belong in this world. Psychologically, what was happening to the liberated prisoners could be called depersonalization. Everything appeared unreal, unlikely as in a dream. We could not believe it was true. How often in the past years had we been deceived by dreams? We dreamt that the day of liberation had come, that we had been set free, had returned home, greeted our friends, embraced our wives, sat down at the table and started to tell all the things we had gone through, even of how we had often seen the day of liberation in our dreams. And then, ever so shrilled in our ears, the signals to get up and our dreams of freedom came to an end. And now the dream had come true. But could we truly believe in it? One day, a few days after the liberation, I walked through the country past flowering meadows for miles and miles toward a market town near the camp. Larks rose to the sky and I could hear their joyous songs. There was no one to be seen for miles around. There was nothing but the wide earth, sky, and larks' jubilation in the freedom of space. I stopped, looked around and up to the sky, and then I went down on my knees. That moment there was very little I knew of myself or a word. I had but one sentence in mind, always the same. I called to the Lord from my narrow prison and he answered me in the freedom of space. How long I knelt there and repeated this sentence memory can no longer recall. The way that led from the acute mental tension of the last days in camp, which we have to consider that a man who has been under such enormous mental pressure for such a long time is naturally in some danger after his liberation, especially since the pressure was released quite suddenly. This danger was, in the sense of a psychological hygiene, is a psychological counterpart of the bends, just as the physical health of the cash worker would be endangered if he left his diver's chamber suddenly. During this psychological phase, one observed that the people with natures of a more primitive kind could not escape the influences of the brutality which had surrounded them in the camp life. Now being free, they thought they could use their freedom licentiously and ruthlessly. The only thing that had changed for them was that they were now the oppressors instead of the oppressed. They became instigators, not object of a willful force and injustice. They justified their behaviors by their own terrible experiences, and this was often revealed in apparently insignificant events. Only slowly could these men be guided back to the commonplace truth that no one has a right to do wrong, not even if wrong has been done to them. We had to strive to lead them back to this truth, or the consequences would have been much worse. Bitterness was caused by a number of things he came up against in his former hometown. When on his return, a man found that in many places he was met only with a shrug of the shoulders and with hackneyed phrases. He tended to become bitter and to ask himself why he had gone through all that he had. But he heard the same phrases nearly everywhere, but did not know about it. And we too have suffered. Then he asked himself, have they really nothing better to say to me? The experience of disillusionment is different. Here was not one's fellow man, but fate itself, which seemed so cruel. A man for years had thought he had reached the absolute limit of all possible sufferings now found that suffering has no limits and that he could suffer still more and still more intensely. But for every one of the liberated prisoners, the day comes when looking back on his camp experiences, he can no longer understand how he endured it all. As the day of his liberation eventually came, when everything seemed to him like a beautiful dream. So also the day comes when all his camp experiences seem to him nothing but a nightmare. The crowning experience of all, for the homecoming man, is a wonderful feeling that after all he has suffered, there is nothing he need fear anymore, except his God.